Salam alaikum, Borodar. Good evening from Doha, everybody, and welcome to the nutrition chapter session of the Aspetar Sports Medicine Collection, an initiative from our editor-in-chief, Dr. Nibil Popovic, supported by Aspire Zone Foundation. On behalf of myself and all the speakers, we are privileged tonight to be able to give you this offering. A little bit of context on nutrition and the Aspetar Sports Medicine Journal before we start. Since 2012, the inception of the journal, there have been a total of 8 articles published on nutrition and hydration. Tonight, I'm really excited to bring you what I think is a world-class lineup to pick up on some of those themes that are in the chapter itself of the new books. And perhaps I'll add a little bit of a modern twist to our athletes in this day. By way of an introduction to some of the experts tonight, and also just to give you an idea of the running order, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sophie Killer, who is going to be our expert on the endurance theme. Dr. Laurent Bannock, who is going to interview Dr. Kevin Tipton on injury and nutrition. Andreas Kasper, who's going to be our expert tonight on football nutrition. And Dr. Ian Rollo, who's going to talk to us about hydration and the impact of new technologies. Tonight, we do start with a local legend here, Shaima Al Khaldi. Shaima Al Khaldi is the Director of Scientific Support at Aspetar, overseeing our sports podiatry, sports psychology and sports nutrition services here. Shaima has a degree in science and nutrition from the College of Science and University of Qatar. Shaima has worked here for 12 years, and prior to which she was a clinical dietitian in the largest clinical corporation in Qatar. Shaima also, I'm very happy to announce, is the holder of the title of being the first Qatari sports dietitian. It's great to welcome her today to talk about Ramadan. Shaima, if you could just introduce your session, please, and the floor is yours.
I'm looking forward today to speaking to you about nutrition support for athletes during Ramadan. Challenges. By the end of my presentation, we would have gone over knowing and learning about the holy month of Ramadan characteristics, also understand challenges athletes may face when fasting and how can this affect their performance, and finally, practical dietary recommendations and supports for athletes to help them overcome fasting challenges. First, I'm going to present to you Ramadan characteristics. What you need to know about the holy month of Ramadan. Ramadan is the 9th month of the lunar calendar, is one of the 5 pillars of the Muslims' faith, which lasts 29 to 30 days. The days of Ramadan change annually, moving forward 11 to 12 days each year. It can therefore take place in either summer or winter seasons, meaning that the challenges of one year may be different to those of the next year. All healthy adults, Muslims, fast in Ramadan from all type of eating and drinking between sunrise and sunset. The duration of a daily fasting is influenced by seasonal and geographical conditions. For example, Muslims here in Qatar fast for around 15 hours a day. However, Muslims living away in European countries fast for shorter hours during winter and longer hours during summer. So fasting Muslims who live at higher latitudes will be mainly challenging during summertime because of the very long daylight hours. What about the dietary habits? What are the dietary changes or habits during Ramadan? During Ramadan, Muslims eat 2 meals a day and more or less 2 snacks with no restrictions on food or fluid consumptions during the night. The first meal after sunset called Iftar, and the other meal before the break of dawn called Suhoor. Additional, as I mentioned, 2 small snacks between those 2 meals. Fasting practice vary according to the individual himself, the culture, and the religious environment, the geographical location, and other factors such as work and family commitment. One of the main dietary changes during Ramadan is the inflexibility with the timing of eating and drinking over the day and in relation to exercise or training sessions. The food and fluid intake timing shift from daylight to nighttime. Also, the food composition is different too during the month of Ramadan. Meals and dishes are mainly made from traditional and occasional food. It is also known that the traditional dishes, especially in the Gulf region and the Middle East during Ramadan, usually made of high carbohydrates, fried food, dessert with a lot of added sugar to it. Now, let us move on to the next question. How are athletes affected? Not all athletes are affected by the changes during Ramadan. It is a personal experience of individual athletes. The effects of Ramadan fasting on the athlete will depend on many factors. The specific sport, the training and competition demands during the month of Ramadan, the environmental conditions, and the length of the daylight. So, fasting can affect training adaptation as well as competition performance. Moving to our next point, challenges. I would like to show you here in this slide challenges that may face some athletes and may not. From all these challenges, we will focus on a few in this presentation. Start by looking at some of these challenges. The first challenge that Muslims athletes may face is fasting in non-Islamic country and environment. It is very different to fast in a Muslim country than a non-Muslim country. As you all may know that the global nature of sport in general means that there are many Muslims living and playing in non-Muslim countries. If the Muslim player training and competing in a Muslim majority nation where the entire community is also the environment and community support. For example, the players here in Qatar or in the Middle East and in Islamic countries often benefit from adjusting the training and competition schedules to reflect Ramadan timings. In non-Islamic countries, it is difficult to change an entire competition or training schedule. The second challenge that athlete may face is the sleep pattern. Sleep pattern changes cause sleep disturbance, which can lead to fatigue, poor concentration, and may result to limited performance and recovery. The sleep could be affected by disturbance in eating habits, fluid intake, time between meals, and social culture impact, for example, the late social events gathering during Ramadan. So the recommendation that may help athlete to cope is to make self-adjustment to the new sleeping schedule during Ramadan. Try to delay waking until mid-afternoon and taking daytime naps of about 30 to 40 minutes. Another challenge I would like to address on this slide is exercise and performance. There are negative beliefs towards that fact that training or competing while fasting may contribute to any kind of drop in performance. Therefore, fasting athletes need to adopt strategies to prevent the possible decline in performance. It is found that athletes who maintain their total energy and micronutrient intake, training load, body composition, and sleep length and quality are unlikely to suffer any significant declines in performance during Ramadan. So we can conclude that finding the balance between physical activity, fluid intake, food, and sleep is challenging for athletes. I'll move on to my next point, which is challenges related specifically to nutrition. As you can see here in this slide, we will mention a few of them, such as dehydration and proper nutrition. Let's start first by looking at examples of some overall nutrition-related challenges during Ramadan. One of these challenges is not being able to have intake of important nutrient at the optimal time of consumption, which is around exercise session, where it is important to support the immediate needs of a performance and recovery. Following healthy diet during Ramadan is also a nutrition-related challenge for Muslim athletes. As we previously mentioned, that it is common for individuals and families in Ramadan to socialize and have meals together, and most of these meals and dishes are high in sugar and fat. Finding balance between exercise load and training is also a challenging concern during Ramadan. As I mentioned in the learning objective slide, I will present to you some of the nutrition practical dietary recommendations that could support the athletes during Ramadan. We can conclude first that Ramadan fasting will have an impact on several variables such as hydration, sleep patterns, and nutrition. And it can potentially reduce athletes' readiness, motivation, and performance. Before suggesting any recommendation, we need to understand that nutritional recommendations while fasting will vary by different factors. Individual needs, sport and training duration, competition frequency, consumption of micronutrients and fluid before and during exercise. We should also take in consideration athletes' specific needs, the biological, psychological needs, and their social and cultural environment. Additional to the nutrition recommendation, we need also to promote appropriate behavioral and social strategy to cope with the Ramadan changes. So the best advice will remain the individual coping strategies approach. Let us start in this slide presenting a few strategies to support athletes during the month of Ramadan. One of the strategies that may help the athletes to cope during Ramadan is that coaches and athletes should consider training while fasting as pre-practice, random days through the year or a few weeks before Ramadan. They may also consider, if possible, nighttime training, because as we know, it will allow athletes to stay well hydrated and to maintain their blood glucose levels, so the recovery from exercise sessions can be effectively accomplished. Avoiding high intensity training during fasting hours and leave it after breaking fast if possible would be one of the strategies that could support athletes in their training schedule. The nutritional support around training sessions and competitions and focusing on promoting recovery are important strategies related to nutrition. It could be met through preparing in advance to have and ensure that suitable food and significant food that meet nutrition goals are available at key times so that the opportunities for eating are not lost. I will present now a few specific nutrition-related challenges and the practical recommendations for them. Keeping the body hydrated is one of the main challenges that athletes may face, especially during summertime. Recommendations that may help athletes to reduce the impact of dehydration are to make sure that their body well hydrated between iftar and suhoor, and to target and focus that the maximal and optimal hydration to be by suhoor time. Drinking also a frequent water frequently in small amounts rather than in one large amount at once. For example, 200 ml every 30 minutes is one of the recommendations. Other recommendation that may support the hydration of the body is consuming food that contains a minimal amount of sodium salts in order to promote greater fluid retention and reduce excessive urine loss. In this slide, I will speak about having proper nutrition during Ramadan as a challenge. Although the total intake of energy and nutrient during Ramadan may not be affected, but the timing of intake is greatly changed, which may result to improper nutrition intake. So our recommendations supporting this challenge are many. First, a proper education to athletes on the proper nutrition when fasting Ramadan and exercising. Consuming a different food rich in micronutrients instead of just limited food group. Having healthy snacks pre and post training will support the athlete to get their proper nutrition. Athletes need to choose carbohydrates rich food and should consume it at the break of fast, at the meal before dawn, and at other meals during evening time. Not just choosing healthy food will support the athletes, limiting the intake also of food high in sugar and fat is important. What are the recommendations that would support athletes to promote their performance on the day of competition or training sessions? Athletes can start with a light iftar meal, taking at least 1 hour before competition or a training. The meal should contain at least 1 gram of carbohydrates per kilogram of body mass to increase carbohydrate availability and to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia after the competition or training. And this meal also may contain different choices of sustained release carbohydrates sources. What about the nutrition recommendation during competition or training sessions? Athletes should be encouraged to practice intake during competition or training sessions. Intake of small amounts of carbohydrates, even in forms of frequent rinsing of mouth with a carbohydrate solution. Moreover, he can consume carbohydrates from range of specialized sport drinks or everyday food such as carbohydrate, electrolyte, sports drinks, gel, bars, fruit, all this according to the specific logistics around the competition and culture of their sport. If the competition or training is more than 60 minutes, then athletes need to develop a personalized nutrition plan. This plan should combine carbohydrates intake and adequate rehydration with the practical opportunities of intake during the competition or training. Also, higher intake of mixture of carbohydrates is one from the recommendation. What about recovery? As we all know, recovery is important for athletes after competition or training, during Ramadan and through the year. So as we know, always consume carbohydrates immediately after the completion of competition or training, if possible. To enhance refueling rate and glycogen storing. Additional to intake of 20 to 25 gram of high quality and fast digestion protein soon after the completion with the consumption of carbohydrate, as we mentioned in the previous point, such as the whey component of milk. This slide will show you or will summarize the requirement of some functional foods, for example, carbohydrates, the protein, as you can see here, vitamins through the fruits and vegetables, and minerals, and the fluid intake together with the suitable timing in order to help maintaining the exercise performance. It was summarized for you the slides that we spoke about previously. So as you can see here, before exercising, during exercising, after exercising, and suhoor meals, for example. What we can summarize from all this. The holy month of Ramadan and act of fasting is important for all Muslims. Major changes during Ramadan are the fasting and the shift of food and fluid intake from during the day to nighttime. Athletes may face challenges which may affect their performance and or impair training adaptations. Adjusting and copying with developing a full personalized approach rather than focusing on single adaptation is the best approach. A practical lifestyle and dietary recommendations can support athletes when fasting the month of Ramadan in combination with careful training planning. So we can summarize that there is no one size fits all. It is always different, and it is always will depend on the individual himself.
Thanks, Shaima. That's a great start for this evening. Moving quickly on to our next presenter, who is Dr. Sophie Killer. Sophie is a very well-respected performance nutritionist who spent over 10 years supporting Olympic athletes, and most notably working with UK athletics for several years. And also 5 seasons working in the Premier League as well in football. She's got numerous publications, most recently on magnesium and athletic endurance performance, as well as other aspects of sports science such as sleep and immunity. Sophie, welcome for this evening. I'm sure I've missed a few things on your bio, so perhaps if you want to start by filling in some of those gaps, and then the floor is yours for endurance nutrition.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Dan. It's an honour to be invited to be involved in this. I'm Dr. Sophie Killer and I'm a performance nutritionist. As Dan said, I work with elite athletes, Olympic, Paralympic athletes and professional athletes. And I'm also, I hold a research fellowship, so I'm actively engaged in research. Today, Dan has given me the task of discussing endurance nutrition in 20 minutes, which is no small feat. So I'm going to whistle through an update on performance nutrition in endurance as quickly as I possibly can. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the evolving world of sports nutrition for the endurance athlete. Well, we certainly have come a long way in the last 70 or so years, going back all the way to the 50s, where the guidelines would be very much to limit the amount of nutrition, or specifically hydration, that endurance athletes should be having. I'm not even going to comment on this photograph from a pro cycling event where it looks like the athletes are sharing a cigarette, but at least they did have some bottles of fluids on the front of their bike, although who knows what was in those. Certainly the scientific developments have enabled really evidence-based performance nutrition, which has had a big impact in the field of sports sciences. And what I'm going to talk about today is specifically how our understanding of carbohydrate metabolism has impacted our knowledge and application of nutrition in endurance sports. I'm going to share with you some new insights from track and field, some research that I've been really lucky enough to be involved in, and then a brief talk about what might be next in the field of nutrition for endurance sports. So cast your mind back to the late 70s, where the Bergstrom muscle biopsy technique was first utilised in this field of science to really start to understand what was happening in the muscle during exercise. And this was amazing because it provided that insight, that first insight into glycogen depletion during exercise. And really for the first time, we understood that low muscle glycogen was associated with exercise-induced fatigue. And this really opened those possibilities for us to start playing around with performance nutrition strategies to make sure that athletes were exercising with full glycogen stores at the onset of exercise, and possibly how we could try and maintain those glycogen stores throughout that endurance exercise. So if we have an overview of carbohydrate flux throughout an exercise session, here at the beginning we have our pre-exercise carbohydrate stores always as high as possible before starting an endurance event. So can we manipulate this? Can we make this higher? Can we influence the utilization or how we burn carbohydrate or glycogen during exercise? And can we speed up the rate of recovery? And carbohydrate can have an influence in each of these different aspects of performance nutrition, of exercise. So yes, there's a wealth of science that shows us how we can maintain and get high glycogen stores through carbohydrate diets. So a kind of 3 to 6 gram per kilo diet of carbohydrate would be recommended for moderate training needs. And we can start to push that higher for our endurance athletes, perhaps 6 grams per kilo upwards, perhaps 10, 12 grams per kilo for some ultra endurance athletes. There's some evidence that you can do carbohydrate loading strategies, looking at supercompensation with a glycogen depleting exercise, maybe a 3-minute all-out glycogen depleting exercise at the beginning of a carbohydrate load to try and push those glycogen stores up even higher. And then, of course, there's loads of research looking at different tapering strategies, how we can reduce our exercise leading into a competition, maybe 24, 48 hours, perhaps even longer, whilst maintaining a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, and how that can really push up glycogen stores pre-exercise. Can we speed up the rate of recovery? Again, there's been some fantastic research over the last 20, 30, 40 years looking at how we can restore muscle glycogen and protein and enhance protein synthesis as quickly as possible and as best as possible after exercise with different feeding strategies. And it's generally understood that a reasonably high carbohydrate intake in those immediate hours post-exercise, particularly a high glycemic index carbohydrate, can really speed up that rate of recovery of muscle glycogen. And there's some brilliant research from Stu Phillips' lab looking at protein and how we can optimize protein recovery and really optimize protein synthesis after exercise, specifically looking at how we periodize protein throughout the day, and that it's better to have reasonably large amounts, say 4, possibly more times across the day to maintain that positive protein balance, as opposed to 1 or 2 really large boluses of protein or lots of small amounts of protein throughout the day. And certainly if our recovery period is less than 6 to 8 hours because the athlete's training twice a day, or perhaps they're in a tournament with heats and rounds, then that recovery nutrition becomes even more important. And can we influence the rate of utilization of carbohydrate during exercise? Yes, and I'm going to come on to some really exciting research here. So this concept of multiple transport carbohydrates came around in the early 2000s from some amazing research from Professor Asger Jukendroop's lab. This was the first time we'd really started to learn that the rate of carbohydrate absorption was limited at the intestinal lining. And here you can see glucose passing through from the stomach into the bloodstream through a glucose transporter that's supported by sodium. And you can see here glucose is moving freely. But if we start to consume large amounts of glucose, so roughly above around 60 grams per hour, you can now see that sugar, those glucose molecules, are starting to build up in the stomach and not able to transport through and be oxidized in the blood where we can use it as a fuel. And this is a problem because not only are we consuming carbohydrate that we're not able to use, so it's a waste, but also it can cause gastrointestinal discomfort if we now have this buildup of carbohydrate in the stomach. So what was really novel about this research is that when you combine fructose with glucose with a different type of sugar, so here fructose, you can now see that sugar molecule is being transported through a different receptor. And now we're able to get glucose across the membrane, and we're also able to get more carbohydrate through a different source, so multiple transport of different sugars from the food that we're consuming into the bloodstream. And what was really novel about this was for the first time it showed that we could have oxidation rates of exogenous carbohydrates, so carbohydrate that we're consuming during exercise, above that kind of threshold of around 60 grams per minute. And now being able to push that even higher to some more like 90 and above. And that would enable more carbohydrate consumption by an athlete, and perhaps greater performance. Following this study, there was a wealth of studies that came out of that laboratory in Birmingham under the supervision of Asger Jukendroop and led to the eventual publication of this paper, A Step Towards Personalised Sports Nutrition, specifically looking at carbohydrate intake during exercise, where they say a single source of carbohydrate can be oxidized at rates of around 60 grams per hour. And this is recommended for endurance exercise lasting a couple of hours. But for those ultra endurance events, so those long distance cycling events, ultra triathlons, Ironman, long distance running, it's actually recommended that higher intakes of more like 90 grams plus per hour are recommended. And carbohydrate ingested at such high ingestion rates must be from these multiple transport carbohydrates to allow that high oxidation rate and prevent an accumulation of carbohydrate in the intestine, where it's likely to cause gastrointestinal discomfort. So this was really, really groundbreaking and really positive step forward in terms of performance nutrition for endurance exercise. Following this, a little bit later on in 2018 came a really brilliant paper from Sam Impey, who was doing his PhD under the supervision of James Morton at Liverpool John Moores. This paper, Fuel for the Work Required, proposed a really nice scientific framework about how you can periodize carbohydrate intake. And there's an example here taken from their paper. So for the first time, this provided the scientific evidence of periodizing carbohydrate across a microcycle, so across the course of a day, across the course of a week, as opposed to a longer term macrocycle where you might look at altering carbohydrate based on training needs, whether that's away at a training camp, trying to maybe lose some body fat. We could now start to zoom in, and this really supported what practitioners were doing in terms of adjusting carbohydrate intake kind of meal by meal, day by day to support those individual training sessions. So now we could really have that evidence to support that applied practice of providing advice to athletes specifically around carbohydrate intakes. And I like to think that all of this research has led to these amazing feats. So in 2019, Eliud Kipchoge was the first person to run a sub 2 hour marathon. And I didn't have the pleasure of being involved in it, but I've been lucky enough to listen to Professor Andrew Jones, who was involved, about all of those key aspects that enabled this amazing feat of endurance. So the careful planning with the environmental conditions, looking at the weather, the humidity, the altitude, making sure it was all optimal for maximal running speed, the pacing strategies that we used, the technology with those amazing Nike shoes, the athlete physiology, but of course, and most importantly for us, the nutrition strategies that were involved and the intricate planning. So instead of feed stations for the athletes to pick up their drinks, they delivered the nutrition via a bike so that they could really prevent the athlete from needing to slow down. Bespoke drinks were provided based on those individual needs using scientific data that we have learned over the years to really optimize carbohydrate delivery. So optimizing the volume of carbohydrate and the concentration of those solutions, and provided every 7 minutes, of course, through the bike instead of the feed stations, making sure pre-race glycogen stores were optimal, and using 2 key supplements, according to Andy. Again, this is information, secondary information, having not been there myself, but using supplements like caffeine and nitrates to really enhance that performance. So I can see how nutrition can play a really, really important role in endurance events like this. Where else can we get our impact from nutrition and endurance? Well, for me, trackside testing is where the magic of performance nutrition really happens. So these continual advances in technology are enabling this further understanding of individual responses of elite athletes. We're not just going to the literature, reading the scientific publications that have actually been collected on data really from a general population and more often than not from university students. We're now able to use these small point-of-care devices and actually collect data from our elite athletes in the field where it's actually happening. And this enables some real life insights as opposed to laboratory insights, which we then have to extrapolate to the impact that might have in the field. And these small devices are actually able to measure lots of different blood biomarkers, for example, lactate and bicarbonate, where we can then really start to design bespoke supplement strategies for sodium bicarbonate, oxidative stress markers, looking at training load and how we can potentially use these devices to prevent overreaching and overtraining, and even small devices that might be able to assess glycogen stores. So we're really lucky that the science has come this far that is enabling us to gather this kind of real-time data. And what about real-time sweat data? Could that be the next step for us? Companies like Flow Biotechnologies are now designing these really small, smart sweat patches that athletes can wear. So they're non-invasive, providing real-time hydration data. And I know Ian Rollo is going to talk more about hydration, so I won't talk about this too much, but this is something that's quite exciting for me, I think. Now we can perhaps get real-time information on sweat rate, electrolyte losses, perhaps on osmolality, and really question mark, what else is it that we could be looking at? And I think it's for us as applied practitioners and researchers to really think about what what might be beneficial in terms of athlete health and athlete performance. And if we can get this information in real time, live time, could that be really beneficial for endurance events if it's linked to your watch and it can give you this live feedback? So it's exciting for me to think about how we could use this data with endurance athletes to enhance performance and recovery. So I want to share with you a new insight from track and field, some work that we've been doing, British Athletics. And it all kind of came about because I started to notice that we were seeing a reasonably high prevalence of magnesium deficiency in our track and field athletes. And I couldn't really get my head around this, because even if you're a vegan athlete, you're still able to consume plenty of magnesium in the diet. So I set about to do some initial research to compare magnesium intakes in the diet with magnesium status in our track and field athletes compared to a normal general population in a collaboration with the University of Surrey. And what we found was that both the athletes and the non-athletes were consuming plenty of magnesium, but our athletes did have a significantly lower magnesium status than non-athletes. So it's kind of intrigued me even further. So we then went on to do a study to look at what was happening to magnesium during exercise. We wanted to specifically look at magnesium losses, and unfortunately we weren't able to do muscle biopsies and look at biochemistry, but we could look at sweat data and we could look at changes in plasma magnesium. And what we found was that plasma magnesium would decline during exercise and then return post-exercise, transiently within a few hours. So what we thought was, if we were to preload magnesium before exercise, could that help stabilize those fluctuations in magnesium? And we did find that that would happen. But whether this is important, whether this has an impact on long-term magnesium deficiency, we don't know. By this point, I'd sparked the interest of the doctors at British Athletics, and we decided to do a big project together where we did a big deep dive into 8 years worth of medical data that we had on our Olympic and Paralympic athletes. Our aim was to understand if there were any associations between gender, ethnicity, athletic discipline, or clinical history of bone stress, muscle injuries, the number of muscle injuries per year, within the year of the blood test, or tendon pain, which was diagnosed as an Achilles or patella tendon pain that lasted longer than 3 months of chronic pain. And we recently published this paper if anyone is interested in having a read. So we had over 500 samples from just under 200 Olympic and Paralympic athletes collected over this 8-year period, analysed for red cell magnesium status. I mentioned the associations we were particularly interested in looking at. We noted that a significant number of athletes did have magnesium deficiency, which was clinically defined as a red cell magnesium less than 1.9 millimoles per litre. What we found was that on at least one blood test during the study, 22% of athletes were identified as being clinically deficient in magnesium. We found that magnesium was significantly lower in female athletes compared to male athletes. It was lower in athletes with black or mixed race ethnicity. It was higher in our throws athletes, and it was also higher in our Paralympians with cerebral palsy. In terms of the clinical outcomes, we found that athletes that had a history of Achilles or patella tendon pain had significantly lower red cell magnesium than average. And what's interesting is that magnesium is involved in the propagation of pain. And actually, there is some clinical research that suggests that there really could be a link here, and that's something that's really interesting for us. We found that every muscle injury was associated with a lower red cell magnesium status. But interestingly, we didn't find any correlations with bone stress injuries, which was surprising for me because magnesium is so closely linked in its metabolism to calcium and vitamin D. But in our cohort, we had relatively low numbers of bone stress injuries. So I think perhaps we were underpowered here, and it's something I'd like to look into further. So we proposed some new guidelines and future directions for magnesium research. We believe it should be an important part of screening for endurance athletes. Currently, from communications I've had across my network, it doesn't seem to be an analyte that's regularly measured in blood screening. We think it probably should start to be included. We proposed some specific guidelines for optimal status for elite athletes. Whereas before we just had clinical guidelines. So based on our research, we've proposed these. And we think really that a lot more research is needed to understand the prevalence of magnesium deficiency across other sports, the importance of magnesium for elite athletes and the risk of inadequate stores, and how maybe fluctuations in plasma status across the course of a training session, how that, why that happens and whether that's actually important, perhaps it doesn't matter if it's returning, within a couple of hours post-exercise, or whether that might contribute to magnesium deficiencies. So my final thoughts are that the collaborations between the scientists and the applied practitioners, and the more people that are able to do both, is really key to the future of performance nutrition in endurance sports. Clearly, a lot more research is needed in these elite endurance athletes, so we don't have to extrapolate data from non-athlete populations. And I think that the developments in this nano biotechnology will really further enhance our understanding of the physiological and metabolic requirements of real life endurance exercise. And again, not just what we are able to measure in the lab. But clearly there's still so much more to learn. And I think it's a really, really exciting time to be involved in performance nutrition, particularly in endurance. And some of you guys might know, but following the sub-2-hour marathon, there's now a new challenge on the horizon with Alistair Brownlee and Lucy Charles Barkley aiming to do sub-7 and sub-8 hour, respectively, Ironman in spring 2022. And clearly nutrition is going to have a really, really big impact on enabling these athletes to achieve such feats. So I very, very much look forward to following their journeys. So thank you again to Dan for inviting me. I appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop overview, and there was so much more that I could have and would have loved to include, but we would have been here all day. Hopefully that's given a little bit of an insight on the history of endurance nutrition and where we're at today. So thank you very much for your time.
Wow. Endurance nutrition in 20 minutes. I think that's a real testament to Sophie's ability as a scientist, a practitioner, and also a presenter. So that was just superb. Thank you very much, Sophie. We move on quickly to our next presenter, who is Dr. Laurent Bannock. Laurent is the founder and director of the Institute of Performance Nutrition. And those of you in nutrition will know his podcast, the award-winning podcast, We Do Science. Laurent is not only, as we call it, a one-trick pony in Wales. He has close to 30 years of practitioner experience in the fields of nutrition, fitness and performance, and worked with many elite professional athletes and professional sports teams. Most notably, in the last FIFA World Cup, he was the lead nutritionist to the Egyptian national football team. Today, Laurent will, for us, be interviewing Professor Kevin Tipton, who all of us know who work in nutrition is the guru to do with nutrition and injury. His research is focused on nutrition and exercise metabolism, with emphasis on protein, nutrition and metabolism, as well as nutrition support for brain injuries. He is an author of over 100 papers, book chapters and review articles. He has also helped develop sports nutrition consensus statements for the IOC, for FIFA, FINA and the IAAF, and has served on the UK Sport Nutritional Supplements Advisory Board. Laurent, thanks for joining us. I am really looking forward to this interview. The floor is yours, my friend.
So it's an honour for Kevin and I to be presenting to you today at this Aspetar online forum session on nutrition and hydration, specifically for the modern athlete. And our presentation focus for you today is going to be actually more of a presentation discussion, all about nutrition for injury, and in particular a look at the evidence with a view to how it applies to practice in the real world setup. So just to give you a quick bit of background to this, what we're talking about here is exercise-induced injuries, which are common not only to recreational athletes, but of course to elite level athletes. And about half of those injuries can be considered really quite severe, leading up to a lot of time off training or competition, as much as 3 or more weeks. And Kev, there's more to it than that though, isn't there?
All right, so for this particular presentation, what we're going to focus on are the injuries that result in immobilization of a limb, or at least injury severe enough that the athlete or exerciser is inactive, their activity level goes down, and that will result in a loss of muscle and a muscle function as well, as muscle mass, and also other tissues will be involved, tendon and bone, etc. So that's what we're going to focus on mostly today.
Now, of course, we're talking about injuries and specifically exercise-induced injuries. And the nature of an injury is that it presents a wide variety of problems to the athlete. And of course, there's a wide variety of potential solutions, including medical solutions, physical therapy, rehabilitative solutions. But these solutions can include nutrition. And that's why we're excited to be talking about this today, because there is now evidence, it's emerging, and we're going to address that, on why giving special attention to nutrition whilst your athlete is injured can actually support this process of wound healing, because we want that athlete to be able to get back to training. We want them to be able to get back to play, back to their events and competition, because if they don't do that, it isn't just impactful in a not great way to the athlete. It also, of course, affects the team. The goals of that team are going to be affected by this. So the research that we're referring to, a lot of this comes back to the review that was written by Professor Tipton, who's going to be talking to us over the next 10 minutes or so about what we know, maybe some emerging areas, and ultimately what the key recommendations and considerations are on this topic. So I guess at the beginning of this, Kev, of all the things that we know, which isn't a lot, and we're going to explore that in today's session, but the most important area is going to be energy balance. Now, that's easy for me to say, but maybe you can help us understand why energy balance is so critical to this process.
Sure. So in general, if we broaden it out a bit, then any kind of deficiency is going to be bad. So deficiency of micronutrients or macronutrients, and in this case, we're talking about energy. So just overall energy needs to be sufficient. So typically what's going to happen is a lot of people, if you talk to them, what their initial response is going to be, hey, I'm not moving around as much. My limb is in a cast, my leg is in a cast, or my arm's in a cast, or whatever, or I'm lying around because I'm sore. I'm not as active. I'm going to eat less. And that's a natural reaction and makes sense. But you got to be careful about that, because if you drop that energy too much and you get into an energy deficit, then you're going to, as it says there, slow wound healing and increase the loss of muscle that's going to happen. Muscle protein synthesis is decreased in an energy deficit. And also, your muscle doesn't respond as well to the anabolic stimulation from protein intake, what we call anabolic resistance. So you sort of get a double whammy, and that exacerbates muscle loss if you're in an energy deficit. Now you say, well, why would you be in an energy deficit? One of the problems is that wound healing itself and just the response to a wound or an injury is going to have an increase in energy expenditure. And so you might be sort of overestimating how much energy underestimating how much is being expended, because you're not appreciating some of these other things, other factors like the wound healing. And also, if you are on crutches, expending to get to the same distance on crutches as you would be walking takes a lot more energy. So it's possible that if you're moving around a lot on crutches, you could actually, energy expenditure could be higher. So the trick is to have energy balance, to make sure you get enough energy. Now, the opposite is also true, where you don't want too much energy, because you're going to gain fat. But even as I've heard people say that, hey, I'm just going to eat enough to make sure I'm not in an energy deficit. If I get a little bit of fat because of that, hey, no big deal. I'll train that off once I get back to full fitness. Well, the problem is that it actually exacerbates the muscle loss. Overeating does. And that's, a couple of studies have suggested that, have shown that in particular, there's a bed rest study. So you don't want to have too much energy, you don't want to have too little energy. So as a practitioner, your job should be to try to monitor, try to estimate as best you can the energy expenditure and try to match that energy balance.
And that's just exactly where, we need to be thinking about this difference between our focus on this, when we talk about science, we use phrases like energy, we talk about macros, amino acids, calories, and so on. But when we're looking at this from the perspective of applying it into practice, communicating this information to real people in the real world, through the practitioner, in the club, on the pitch, and so on, we're going to want to take this from a food first perspective. And specifically, we need to understand that an effective nutritional strategy needs to be a well-balanced diet. And that's what the evidence supports. And that's why we use phrases like food first. And this is where what we're talking about is not just focusing on how many calories you're going to have, because that balanced diet needs to be consisting of a wide variety of whole foods, different colors, different sources of foods that are minimally processed, because that's what's providing the body with the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, and the other factors that we require to be healthy, which of course athletes aren't just athletes, they're also human beings, they need to be healthy. Now this of course does lead into a number of grey areas that may be supported by performance nutrition interventions and sports supplements, and we're going to address that in a minute. But I guess the biggest area, the most popular area beyond energy balance is the topic of protein, Kev, and you're definitely the man to talk us through the role that protein has in exercise-induced injuries. So where does it fit in, and why is it an important consideration?
Yeah, it is probably at least for macronutrients, is the most important one to consider. Now, as I mentioned before, if you are immobilized or your activity level drops because you're injured, well, then protein intake is probably going to go down. If you drop your energy expenditure, protein intake will probably go down proportionally. Now, the problem is, as I mentioned, is that protein synthesis goes down, both basally and in response to protein intake. So increased protein intake is probably important. Now, there are several studies that support this. In immobilized individuals and in bed rest, etc., seeing that higher protein intakes can protect that muscle and you don't lose as much, which means that the bottom is not as low, and so getting back to where you need to be is easier. And so as you see there, probably recommendation of around 2 or even a little bit more, 2.2 grams per kilo body mass of protein is probably where you want to be. Now that might be difficult in some individuals if energy intake is too low. So that's a challenge that you need to think about.
So Kevin, as you look at this screen, we can see common sources of protein such as meat, fish, eggs. Potentially there are plant sources of proteins. Are there any considerations in terms of the types of proteins, and what about the unique needs and preferences that some athletes have? And I'm thinking, of course, not just a need for more protein, and not just necessarily whether it's food-based or do they supplement, but what about the kinds of proteins and the kinds of supplements if they follow a plant-based diet, or for religious reasons they are excluding certain sources of proteins? Are there any considerations there, Kev, that we need to bear in mind with exercise-induced injuries and supporting them through nutrition?
I think those sorts of questions are much less important than the total amount of protein. If we do a reductionist look at it, then you can definitely see, if we take an individual protein, say whey protein, and we compare that to soy protein, a plant protein, then we can see differences in protein synthesis. But that happens acutely. But when we translate that to if you're going to take in 2 or 2.2 grams per kilo, then it doesn't really make that much difference. That just getting the total amount of protein is most important. And I wouldn't worry too much about the sources of protein. That even a vegan diet at that high level of protein, it's going to be tough to get that much protein probably, but it's going to be, or at least a challenge, maybe not difficult. But I would say that you focus on getting the protein in more than the protein sources. Now, when possible, of course, high quality protein, animal proteins, lean proteins, especially if you're watching your energy intake, are going to be something to consider.
So this very much fits into that phrase we are starting to hear a lot more in sport and exercise nutrition of total, then type, then timing. So what about timing? Is timing going to have any impact, or is it really still just back to the total again?
Well, timing could make a difference. It's a little bit controversial, but it seems like there's a concept called the muscle full effect. So if you keep your amino acid levels from your protein intake stay high, so if you're eating constantly and you keep those amino acids high, then protein synthesis in the muscle tends to start dropping. So, but if you let the amino acid levels in the blood go down and then come back up again, then you get a renewed stimulation of protein synthesis. So that's really what you want to do, is kind of spread your protein out a little bit throughout the day. So, have it in spread out in, between 2, 3, 4 hours between protein meals.
And look, supplements are always popular for one reason or another. And oftentimes there's a belief that they'll do things that perhaps they won't do. And I guess one of the real topical areas is not just about protein specifically, but the amino acids, and particularly the branched chain amino acids. And I know we've done podcasts about this, and you've written about this and ranted about this topic. But for this particular situation, is there any benefit to individual supplementation of amino acids or leucine in particular? And where I'm going with this is, generally for anyone, and maybe a specific scenario where somebody is on a special kind of diet, like a vegan or vegetarian diet.
Again, if protein intake is sufficient, if you're getting up in that 2 grams per kilo range, I really don't see any argument for having any other supplements, leucine included. You should be getting plenty of leucine in that diet to trigger it. Now, there are probably going to be people that would disagree with that, and again, you can pick out certain studies, but it's not consistent. The studies aren't consistent with this kind of thing, and certainly in this particular instance, in an injury situation, there are no data suggesting this. In theory, you can make the argument for leucine, but again, if you're getting enough protein, you should be getting enough leucine, so I wouldn't worry about it. As far as with a vegan diet or something like that, again, you're going to have people that might argue that, but at that high amount of protein, you should be getting enough leucine even in a vegan diet. I would think.
That's great. So again, that just reinforces that the approach is very much about a food first approach that we've been advocating. Now,
can I just say one other thing? Yeah. You could argue that if there's a smaller individual, say, who their energy expenditure is low, so energy balance is low, that 2 grams per kilo is going to be a big chunk of their energy intake, but still it might not be that much total protein. And then there might be an argument for leucine, but I would say that's going to be very rare.
Okay. So, Kev, you've pretty much made a case for there being no case for amino acid supplementation as long as they're getting enough protein. But, when we look at the evidence, the data out there, there is a couple of supplements, they're very popular supplements, that may potentially have some benefit in certain contexts. What are your perspectives on creatine and omega-3s, which obviously are on the screen right now?
Okay, so if we think about recovery from an injury in sort of 2 phases, the first phase is when that limb is immobilized or the athlete is inactive. So then muscle is being lost during that phase. And then you get the time when you start rehab and gaining muscle back to try to get back up to full fitness. So if we look at the first phase, when muscle is being lost, creatine, it's controversial. There are studies on both sides, but my take on it would be I wouldn't mess with creatine during that time because it's not clear that that's going to be advantageous. On the other hand, as in any other type of place or any situation where you're wanting to gain muscle, when you're in that rehab recovery situation, then creatine will be effective as it does in sort of normal hypertrophy. It's sort of the opposite with the omega-3 fatty acids. There is evidence in animal studies for sure, and some in humans that suggest that omega-3 fatty acids can ameliorate that muscle loss during that inactivity and immobility phase. Now, the catch is that it looks like the mechanism is not due to this anti-inflammatory property of the omega-3 fatty acids, but instead it's the incorporation of the omega-3 fatty acids into the muscle cell membrane and maybe even into the mitochondrial membrane. And so that takes a while. It takes at least 3 or 4 weeks before that becomes effective. At least so far, that's the evidence that we have now. It might be shorter, and we need to look into that, but we don't know. So if that's the case, then if you get injured and then start taking omega-3 fatty acids, it might not do you much good, because by the time you start getting any impact from those omega-3 fatty acids, you're already getting ready to start into your recovery phase. Now, the evidence so far looks like omega-3 fatty acids in a hypertrophy situation, like in the recovery and rehab phase, aren't effective, so they're no good. So the one time you might think about omega-3 fatty acids is if an athlete knows that they have surgery scheduled at a certain point, down the road, and they can start taking the omega-3s 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time. Then maybe that will help while they're recovering from the surgery to ameliorate the muscle loss after the surgery.
Well, there you have it. I mean, there's a lot to this, and of course, there's a lot more to be learned about what is actually the best nutritional strategy to support or enhance recovery from exercise-induced injuries. And of course, we'll look forward to seeing that evidence as it comes in. But for now, if we take the keys from what's being discussed today, and of course the evidence that exists on this, deficiencies, particularly those of energy, protein, and the micronutrients, by following a balanced diet, is really what we need to focus on as we keep driving home this concept of a food first approach. We need to be careful about the unique needs and preferences of each individual athlete, their training needs, their religious needs, potentially their personal needs, and of course where they are in their phase of training, and as we've mentioned, as it may relate to their return to play or their return to training or whatever. But fundamentally, the ultimate recommendation here is going to be first, do no harm. So you need to assess the need, assess the risk, and then assess the consequences before you start to give advice and recommendations of this sort. You're going to want to read more about this. Kevin's paper here is pretty much the first port of call. There may be some more work coming out soon on this, but this is a great place to start. It's open access. Kev and I have done an hour or so conversation specifically on this topic in one of my podcasts here, episode 110. We've also done a couple of podcasts recently on exercise-induced muscle damage with Dr. Daniel Owens, and Kev and I talked about muscle protein breakdown in this other podcast you can see here, if you really want to take a deep dive into this topic. But do come check out everything that we do at the IOPN, the Institute of Performance Nutrition, our online diploma in performance nutrition. And with Kev on board as our Director of Science and Research, you can be looking forward to our growing research projects that we look forward to bringing out in the coming months and years. So, Kev, we've done it. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Absolutely perfect, as always. Really enjoyed that. Thank you, Laurent. Moving again quickly on to our next presenter, Andreas Kasper, currently working as a performance nutritionist at Chelsea Football Club, Fulham Football Club, and AC Sparta Prague, and is the head of football services at Intra Performance Group, managing the nutrition football clinic there. He is currently completing his PhD in cellular and molecular physiology at Liverpool John Moores University. He's published articles on return to play after prolonged training restrictions in contact sports, other areas such as carbohydrate mouth rinsing, and notably he was a co-author on the seminal paper to Podium, quantifying translational potential of performance nutrition research. Now, unfortunately, Andy's internet isn't great tonight, so you won't be able to see him, which he kind of says is not a bad thing. Andy, welcome tonight. I am looking forward to really hearing your session on football nutrition and perhaps specifically how you feel the recent UEFA expert statement on nutrition from 2020 will have an impact. The floor is yours.
So in terms of what I'm going to talk today within this presentation is surrounding two main themes. Number one will be an update on what current best practice guidelines are within football, and it will specifically surround the UEFA consensus group statement that came out sort of mid last year. And then secondly, I'm just going to try and draw upon some of my experiences within working in the English Premier League and also European football, to try and provide some insights into what you may find day to day and navigating some of the, I guess, easy pitfalls that I've seen within my practice across the years. Just as a side note, just due to confidentiality, I'm going to keep everything quite generic and not speak about any individual specifically, just to try and avoid any conflicts. And the main focus of the presentation is going to be on men's first team football, because that's where my expertise currently lie. So I guess the first question is, why do another consensus statement? And it mainly surrounds the fact that the last consensus statement that was conducted was back in 2006, which is obviously 15 years ago now. That's a long time, both in practice and research, and there was definitely a real need to update guidelines because things change. There's a diverse amount of literature released every single year that needs to be filtered, and I guess systematic reviews and meta-analyses usually draw a conclusion about one specific area, so you'd have to probably consult many of those to try and draw a better picture of football specifically. So I think it's a really great piece that needed doing, really drawing together all those different aspects of research and practice into one piece that can be read easily by everybody. And I guess the four main areas that needed to be covered was definitely this update in research. There's a lot more guidelines on fueling and recovery out there. There's definitely an increased physiological demand to football. In some ways it's a different sport, definitely a different beast to what it was in 2006. There's more high speed loading and more games in a week, more games across the whole season, less breaks in the season. The higher you work, you have obviously more international players, more international games. There's a much higher load than there was in 2006. So it's how do we need to fuel and prepare players to cope effectively and recover effectively around that. I guess also there's a big focus around rehabilitation and return to play and transitioning through that pathway successfully. So it's how we can support that from a nutritional point of view to help players get back in the best both physical shape but also with the best properties of the physiology that we can as nutritionists. And also there's a diverse range of supplements that have been released over the past 15 years, things that we never used to research, never really used to know about. So there's a lot more mechanistic research that can be applied within the sporting context. So again, just probably draw upon some of those. And I guess off the back of all those different things that we were missing in the 15 years of missing consensus in one place, the steering committee, which included the director at Intra Performance Group, a gentleman called James Collins, published an initial editorial which highlighted the requirement or the need for a new consensus. Off the back of that, they obviously went to recruit lots and lots of different practitioners and academics, and over the next 3 or 4 years they wrote the consensus, and it was published last year. I think it was June, don't quote me on that, but it was definitely June, July 2020, but we'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of the differences in physical demands, I just wanted to throw up this graph quickly. So this was taken from the Aspetar Sport Medical Journal, by one of my colleagues at Liverpool, John Moores, and they looked at what the differences in high intensity distance, both with possession and also ball out of play and without possession, was, and found it was significantly greater between 2006, when that initial FIFA consensus was done, and 2012, and then obviously we're another 6-7 years on from then. So has it increased even more, the question is, and the answer is probably yes. Certainly in terms of number of games like we've discussed, but also probably the physiological demands actually within the sport. So the consensus statement was written, the final outputs were published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. I know, speaking with James, they tried to get a blend of applied researchers and also scientific academics, and try and really blend science and practice together. I know that they chose people from many different countries to try and draw upon lots of different cultures and what they might see in their applied work. And it was actually, I think, just looking at the numbers I've got jotted in my notes, it's 9 different countries across 4 different continents. So I guess it does really encompass sports nutrition across the world. There was a big piece which was the main consensus statement, which is on the left there, and 2 smaller case study / reflective pieces from coach and team doctor, which we'll discuss shortly. And then also nothing is complete without a nice visual summary, so they also drew in some expertise for a few infographics that were released that really complement the piece. So then, speaking with James, just with regards to the coach-specific reflective piece, I know that they wanted to draw somebody in who was very iconic within football, very successful, and Arsene Wenger was the person they chose. And I guess it's firstly from the fact that both Alan and James had worked with Arsene previously, but also that he is a real pioneer within sports science practice in the elite environment. He was probably one of the first pioneers to actually start integrating sports science into football, all the way back in the 1980s when he was at Monaco. But his reflective piece is quite a powerful quote that I like from it. But he initially introduces the fact that often sports science within football has its ideas, but not very often does it actually draw upon the coach's perspective, because it could provide valuable insights into how to change performance, because ultimately it's how we fit into that multidisciplinary team, including the coaches as well. And it's a really good perspective of what coaches think within football, and I think it's probably encompasses a lot of other coaches' thoughts and feelings. So for anyone who hasn't read it yet, I definitely recommend it. It's a really nice read, but also helps open your eyes a little bit to what coaches may want within the field of football, and take the nutrition bits as well out of that. So then, in the main body of the consensus statement, there was a few different factors that they thought were the key factors that they wanted to cover within the consensus statement. So just reading from the slide, we have the physiological demands, training nutrition, match nutrition, special considerations, nutrition during rehab, supplementation, the female player, the junior player, and then also they actually covered some information around nutrition for referees. So it tries to really cover the most relevant questions that we might have as practitioners. So it really is a good point of call for the foundations of what you might do within football specific applied work. It creates a really good fundamental foundation of research to go and drive your practice to begin with. I think some of the really good things that they actually covered within the consensus is big questions surrounding domestic travel and European travel. There's often a long haul international flight for international players. Equally, there's also movement within country, depending on how big the country is, and that sort of travel aspect of things to consider. they also provide some guidance or some special considerations around different environmental conditions, going from the very cold of Russia to the more hot climates of Spain and Portugal, and then even the more humid climates like Brazil, for example, and cover aspects of nutrition for that, and really just tie in very well the different cultural considerations for football, because it is a global sport. There's a diversity of where we compete, how we compete, times that we compete. There's also cultural considerations like Ramadan fasting, which is obviously something going on at the moment, and equally, really other aspects towards nutrition that potentially junior practitioners may never consider to begin with. So it really is good for encompassing all that information. Equally, there's some good parts on nutrition for rehabilitation, including inflammation, tendon injury. So it does really cover all those different aspects. And then equally, the really growing areas of research at the minute on female athletes and specifically female football, and also junior athletes and junior football. Okay, so second part of today is just around some reflections on practice that I've had or that I've drawn from other people's experience from speaking to different people, and some of the things you may take and consider into your own practice away from. So just considering the change in demands of football. I know we've briefly spoken before about how football's very different now to back in the last consensus statement in 2006, whereby high intensity distance, amount of games played, etc. is all increased. But there's also considerations to make probably between leagues that you work in as well. So currently, in terms of the high intensity and distance covered in different leagues, probably the Premiership is the top of the table for those physiological aspects. Now, it may not be too dissimilar to the other leagues, but it's just one consideration that you might make is what is the actual physiological demands of the league that the team you work with actually plays in. Consider the environment, consider the distance covered, high intensity distances, games in a week, and really start to knit together a better picture of your own specific situation with the teams you might work with, as opposed to taking this sort of one size fits all, what fits for one team or league fits for all teams or leagues. So probably one of the biggest considerations that I've had in some of the roles that I work with are that we know that the amount of expats or overseas players from different leagues is increasing across all leagues, but within the English Premier League it's probably some of the highest observed, whereby it's around 60-70% of players are actually not from England. So the question is that how do we actually engage athletes from different cultures who may not speak the language? Obviously, there's no substitute for not speaking the language, because ultimately, when we want to change nutritional behaviour and change someone's nutritional habits, having that relationship whereby there's trust between the two parties, etc., is obviously very, very important. So clubs, I guess, often employ people dependent on languages that they can speak, but that's not always the case, and you often come into these not barriers but times or periods where it's difficult for you to communicate sometimes with players. So making an effort to learn bits of their language is always a positive, and really building that relationship, having conversations with them, not always about nutrition. You may be there to ultimately change nutritional habits, but to build that relationship, what drives that player? Do they have a family at home? Asking about family, it shows that you actually care about what you're doing, care about the player, and often that can help with that transition of trust. I think also liaising with the people around the player can be a very helpful, important task. Obviously, for example, some of the teams that we work with may have masseuses or medical staff who are very close to that player. So also tying them into some conversations that you can. Obviously you have to be careful because some bits are confidential, but tying them into conversations can often be a good way of helping that player understand, helping everyone be on the same page, and again, work as part of that multidisciplinary team. And that probably leads me on to my next point, which is the second part of the case study / reflective pieces that we discussed before. So this was from a gentleman called Professor Tim Mayer, who is currently, I think, at Germany football team. But again, he speaks really about the importance of working within the multidisciplinary team. Number one sort of abstract that we pulled here is talking about communication between both staff and players being important, and that's obviously what we just discussed. And the second nice highlighted bit that he draws upon is the pressure sometimes for practitioners to come up with some magic solution to a problem. But ultimately, from our perspective, we need to make sure that's evidence-based research and is appropriate for what we're doing, instead of just picking one of these magic fad bullets to tick a box so that the medical team or the multidisciplinary team think that we are doing something. Ultimately, we have to stick to our beliefs and drive those well-researched aspects of nutrition, as opposed to trying to find a solution where there may not necessarily be one. And then also, not only within the applied role do we have to manage ourselves within that multidisciplinary team, but also with the amount of signings that occurs currently in the English Premier League, which is twice a season over the summer and in the January period. What I would say is there's also other stakeholders that come alongside these new signings, and that can include people like agents, partners, chefs, their own personal nutritionists that they've worked with for many, many years, or coaches and international teams that you may not have worked with. And sometimes you have to be really conscious of how you deal with those different relationships. So really considering how closely you work with their own nutritionists, just to make sure that everything aligns throughout when they're within the club and also when they're not within the club. And there's that really diverse group of stakeholders. But dealing with all these people and also the multidisciplinary team and the athlete themselves often takes a lot of time, and that comes with itself a burden. So just something that you need to consider is how you allocate your time and strategize specifically for each player, and make sure you do that accordingly. Final one I actually stole from James Collins. I really like this. I'm big on confidentiality and not really shouting about what we do too much in the applied world, but he uses this nice little analogy of loose lips might sink ships, and that's really applicable within the professional football environment. It's a big business where ultimately small slips and things on social media are always picked up on. So that's why probably a lot of the most influential practitioners are actually quite quiet on that sort of social media stage. And that's something that I've discussed quite a lot with James, which is... Okay, so hopefully through the discussion about the UEFA consensus piece and also the little bit on some of the pitfalls you may experience in practice, that's given you a little bit of an insight into where to potentially initially start when you're looking into nutrition for football, as the UEFA piece forms that really good foundation for practice. And hopefully the second part of the presentation has given you a good idea of some of the things that you actually need to consider when you're working with some of these teams. I guess my final point on the presentation today would be that the UEFA piece is a great fundamental piece of nutrition that really summarises the current available evidence within the literature. However, as you know, literature always progresses and more research comes out every year. So the best practice, or the best available practice, is likely to change.
Andy, thanks very much. A huge seminal paper from a football nutrition perspective. It's got so much in it. I think as a practitioner, from my perspective, some of the key things that I picked out was just being able to go over some of the best practice in the pre, during, and even extra time sort of strategies that are available these days. But it also really tackles some of the core questions which we get asked as practitioners quite a lot. For example, things to do with body composition of football players and ideal targets for certain positions, but also more modern day things like relevant sort of reds, for example, but also some of these things around adolescent football and the competitive adolescent footballer. You know, what should they be doing with their nutrition practice, and that perhaps sometimes it's not always the best thing to be mirroring what senior athletes are doing. So this paper for me really helped within my practice, and I was really glad tonight that Andy could share some of that, and also some of his own sort of practical advice from his work within those couple of clubs. We're going to move on quickly to our final speaker tonight. Last but not least is Dr. Ian Rollo, who is the principal scientist for PepsiCo Research and Development Life Scientists, where he leads the PepsiCo innovation team on healthy aging. Ian is also the principal scientist and head of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, a fantastic resource for practical peer-reviewed information on nutritional related subjects. One of the most recent ones being omega-3s, which Kev Tipton and Laurent touched on in their session. His current role involves providing nutrition support for professional soccer clubs such as FC Barcelona and Manchester City. Ian also manages clinical research projects and is involved in developing novel technologies to support athletic performance. Ian, thanks for joining us tonight. If you could give us a quick insight into your session and what your aim is from this, and then the floor is yours, my friend.
Hello, my name is Ian Rollo, and I'd like to thank Dr. King for the invitation to contribute this talk on modern hydration strategies and the impact of technology. The aim will be to provide an introduction to hydration and share with you some of our experiences in developing technology to inform hydration strategies. First, let us recap on why hydration is of interest. Water is the largest component of the human body. In fact, water accounts for approximately 60% of body mass in the average athlete. But this will vary depending on body size and body composition. Water plays an important role in numerous physiological processes. It functions as a solvent, providing a means of transportation of materials throughout the body. It is important for the delivery of nutrients, the transport of oxygen to the brain and exercising muscles, as well as the excretion and removal of waste products. Water balance is also important in blood volume and blood pressure regulation. And finally, and of most relevance today, water plays an important role in body temperature regulation. This is my statement, which I modified from a great quote from Sirio Farrell, who's a sword fighter in the book series Games of Thrones. All athletes are made of water. Do you know this? If you exercise them, the water leaks out. And we know the physiological consequence of exercise is the generation of heat. The main mechanism to dissipate that heat is through sweating. And let's be absolutely clear, we want our athletes to sweat. If the athlete is not sweating, the likelihood is they are not working very hard. The human body is designed to sweat. In fact, the largest of our organs, the skin, as I like to say, is perfectly perforated with millions and millions of sweat. So what is sweat? Well, primarily sweat is 99% water. but will also contain varying concentrations of different electrolytes. The main electrolyte found in sweat is sodium, together with its associated anion, chloride, which is why if you've ever been exercising, you take a lick of your own sweat, it will taste salty. The losses of electrolytes will be determined by their concentration in the sweat, partnered with the rate of sweating, which can be influenced by genetics, but also by the training status of the individual, the intensity of the exercise, the humidity of the environment, the environmental temperatures, as well as the equipment which the athlete is wearing. And it's the evaporation of sweat from the skin's surface, which is the primary mechanism by which heat is lost from the body during exercise. And this prevents rapid rises in the body's core temperature. Sweat rates will range between 1 to 2 litres per hour. And understanding these fluid losses and replacing these fluids is important for maintaining the body's hydration status. Now, the process of sweating causes a deficit in body water. Despite having access to cool, palatable fluid, athletes still dehydrate during training and matches, leading to a phenomenon more commonly known as voluntary dehydration. The higher the sweat rates, the greater the risk of experiencing varying degrees of hypohydration, which can be classified as mild, which is the equivalent of losing 2% of pre-exercise body mass losses, moderate, 5% of body mass losses, and severe, 10% or more losses in pre-exercise body mass. Now, it's highly likely that individual athletes will be more or less sensitive to different levels of hypohydration. Nevertheless, the available literature suggests that hypohydration equivalent to 2% of body mass losses during exercise are associated with impaired thermoregulation, a decrease in cognitive performance, impaired skill execution, reduced aerobic performance, and finally and importantly, an increase in the perception of effort, all of which it is reasonable to suggest are important variables to consider for both training and competition. So what should we do about this? Well, this slide shows that the sweat rate and sweat sodium data from over 1,300 athletes tested by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute over several years. This is a very comprehensive group of athletes with varying ages, body masses, who have exercised in a variety of environmental conditions. As you can see by the graph on the left-hand side, there is a range in the sweating rates and also a range in the sodium lost in sweat. So quite simply, this slide demonstrates that athletes sweat differently from one another. Even athletes within the same sport, when competing in the same training sessions, in the same environmental conditions, will sweat differently from each other. And if you're interested to read more, we have just had a published paper that reports the fluid balance of professional soccer players, professional football players, in response to training in different exercise intensities and in different environmental conditions. Now, in healthy individuals, the human body is remarkably capable of regulating total body water. The sensation of physiological thirst is stimulated by either a decrease in the amount of water in the blood, also called hypovolemia, or by increased plasma osmolality, which is an increase in the concentration of dissolved particles such as sodium or glucose, for example, in the blood. Both of these changes occur with hydration as a consequence of sweating. The perception of thirst can also be increased or decreased by signals arising from the mouth, the throat, and the stomach. However, other factors unrelated to thirst and hydration status can also affect how much fluid an athlete consumes. These include simply how much an athlete likes a beverage, the availability, as well as social and cultural factors. A key point to consider here is that athletes will already be hypohydrated when physiological thirst mechanisms are stimulated. So considering hydration strategies, we can put these into two main categories. The first is drink to thirst, also known as ad libitum, and in principle states that our sensation of thirst is more than adequate to dictate fluid intake during exercise. The second is planned drinking, which can be defined as drinking a predetermined amount of fluid. And this volume of fluid is determined by the knowledge of individual sweat rates. It's important to note here that both these guidelines state that players should avoid hypohydration greater than 2 to 3% of their pre-exercise body mass. And both absolutely recommend that athletes should not accumulate body mass during exercise through fluid intake. Both state they support performance. And as such, I've prepared this slide as an attempt to provide a guide as to which plan to follow, because of course it depends. As the duration of exercise exceeds 90 minutes, there is more of a need for a planned drinking versus ad libitum drinking. In addition, as we move from cool to hot environments, again, planned drinking is advised. But this is also dependent on the intensity. High intensity, prolonged exercise in the cool may also require planned drinking. And this is also linked to the risk of fatigue. Low risk of fatigue, ad libitum drinking is fine. But with a high risk, hydration strategies begin to be combined with fueling strategies, so that then an individualized plan is recommended. Finally, for those individuals playing sport for enjoyment and participation, then drinking to thirst is more than acceptable. However, in my experience, as we shift from participation to a performance-orientated outcome, then a planned drinking regime is recommended. Now, this slide is a schematic of how to measure sweat rates and sweat sodium concentrations in the field. Often, a urine sample is collected prior to the test as an indicator of the athlete's pre-exercise hydration status. Then, to measure sweat rate, body weight must be taken before and after the exercise session, with the athlete in minimal clothing. The athlete's drinks bottle also needs to be weighed before and after to correct for any fluid consumed. To measure sweat sodium concentration, absorbent patches are placed on the athlete's body and then removed once saturated for the analysis of electrolytes. Now, based on sweat testing data, we can advise and provide recommendations because, of course, all drinks are consumed on a voluntary basis. In my experience, educating players on how to monitor their own hydration status and how their fluid requirements change depending on the exercise and on different occasions is the strongest tool for driving voluntary fluid intake. So we repeat the sweat test at different exercise intensities and environmental conditions, as we've discussed, but also during different types of exercise. So either on the field or during any supplementary works, such as resistance exercise. And this can generate individual reports, which we can communicate verbally, but typically in combination by sending the results out and reminders to the athlete's telephone. allowing us to build this profile of hydration recommendations. Now, this slide highlights some of the limitations around our current methods, especially the field method to measure sweat profiles in athletes. Mainly is that it is very labor intensive. It requires a scientist to be in the field to conduct the testing, to analyze the data, and to generate the reports. And this time commitment becomes amplified when testing with teams with larger squads, such as American football, for example. Other limitations include, we know that a one-off urine sample for pre-exercise hydration is not an accurate measure in isolation. But urine indices should be combined with daily body mass monitoring and subjective sensations of thirst. Furthermore, weighing drinks bottles before and after exercise gives little insight into the drinking pattern and behavior of the athlete. And also, as we've mentioned, as athletes sweat differently depending on the intensity and environmental conditions, we need to repeat this process ideally. And this is therefore more labor intensive and time consuming, both for the practitioner and the athlete. Now, one way in which technology has improved the field sweat testing protocol has been the advanced equipment provided for the analysis of the sweat. Now, historically, sweat samples would need to be collected and analysed in the lab, which would be expensive and result in a delay in the feedback which we can provide to the athlete. And this is why we look to develop a portable, quicker, cheaper, but reliable and valid tool to measure sweat sodium. So in 2014, Lindsay Baker and colleagues at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute collected sweat samples from 7 anatomical sites on 30 athletes during a 1-hour cycle in a heat chamber. Now, after removal, 1 patch per site was centrifuged and the sweat was analysed by either the gold standard lab technique, which is the HPLC, or by using this portable Horiba device pictured in yellow. Now, the validation of this device would mean that the sample could be analysed close to the end of the test and reduce the time from the test completion to the results sharing. And this study found a strong correlation between the Horiba syringe technique and the HPLC centrifuge analysis, meaning that the Horiba can now be used as a tool with confidence to measure sweat sodium concentrations. However, this method is still reliant on a scientist being present. Now, to overcome this limitation, GSSI partnered with Northwestern University and Epicor Biosystems to develop a single-use wearable patch. And we call this a GX patch. Now, this patch can collect sweat through small inlets, and the sweat transverses a channel which passes through an orange dye on the sweat rate side through microfluidics. The local sweat rate can be then measured simply by measuring the distance that sweat travels through the channel. On the upper end, the sweat passes through a colorimetric assay that can measure the concentration of electrolyte in the sweat and via the concentration of that purple color in the channel. And you can read more about the validation of skin interfaced microfluidic systems by following this reference, again by Lindsay Baker and colleagues, published late last year. And this year, for the first time, Gatorade made this technology commercially available. The patch works in conjunction with a GX application on smartphones and devices. So when an athlete is finished exercising, they will open the app and they scan the patch. The app then takes the photo and then instantly predicts the sweat rate and sweat sodium concentrations of the athlete for that particular exercise. These recommendations are based on bespoke GSSI algorithms, which can be applied to that data to give the athletes recommendations. After building up a profile, the athlete will receive recommendations, not just on hydration, but the GX application has the capacity to build in other sports nutrition considerations, such as preparation and recovery. And the patch is just one component of an ecosystem of technological tools, if you like, surrounding hydration and sports nutrition. These include a GX weighing station, a smart bottle, which will give us real-time drinking, real-time fluid consumption, and then if we know the composition of the beverage in the bottle, it will also give us real-time carbohydrate intake. And then this system will then be linked to a range of personalized hydration products. And ultimately, this is designed to help build a profile to inform individual fluid and sports nutrition requirements. So in summary, hydration is an area of nutrition science we can easily monitor and influence the player's behavior through recommendations and careful planning. It is also an area of nutrition we can personalize to the individual player based on their unique sweat rates, sweat composition, training environment, and competition requirements. It's important to emphasize that it's important to practice any given hydration strategy, especially when combining it with carbohydrate ingestion. But gradually, these technologies discussed today and beyond will become more affordable and as such more accessible to athletic populations. Therefore, if we consider the impact that new technologies will have, it will be the rapid and widespread monitoring of the athlete's hydration status during training and competition. And these insights will allow us to link hydration practices to performance or other key outcomes that the athlete or coaches can better relate to. Speeds, distance covered, pass completion, injury, for example. Ultimately, incorporating technology will give us an approach to give us more information on the individual tolerances and personal requirements to better maintain the player's health and athlete performance.
Thanks, Ian. What a great session to finish on. Being a bit of a technology head myself, love seeing all these gadgets and things for the future. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes looking at some key themes of all the sessions and perhaps looking forward, really. Tonight you've heard a great array of sessions for the modern athlete, in my opinion. You've heard really that it is possible to maintain performance during a Ramadan period by adopting specific strategies during training, but also actually during the match. I mean, just from the media yesterday, I'm reading in a Premier League match between Leicester City and Crystal Palace, the two medical doctors agreeing that a goal kick would be delayed for the Muslim athletes to be able to break their fast, which I think is a real modern example of how things are being applied. We've also heard in injury, it's all about the total level, the type, the timing remaining the key from the protein perspective within the injury nutrition, and that really perhaps taking additional leucine isn't always required if total protein is being met. And that the 2015 paper by Kevin Tipton remains the paper to go to if you want further information on nutrition and injury. With regards to endurance nutrition, we've heard from Sophie tonight about the exciting possibilities again of nanotechnology, and also red cell magnesium and the possible role in screening to reduce tendon-related injuries, and also going forward, some interesting areas to do with pain and pain management. And she also makes the really important point, as does Andy, our final speaker, about the importance of collaborations between scientists and practitioners, and perhaps increasing the amount of people in the field who can do both. And lastly, we've heard from the football side, the long overdue consensus for nutrition in football, which we all really hope goes some way towards helping our practitioners, coaches and medics changing behaviours and linking back into what is best practice in football in a really key space. Just to finish on 2 admin points. If we've whetted your appetite tonight in sports nutrition, I'm super chuffed to be able to show you our latest, if I can, our latest publication, which is a targeted edition on sports nutrition, 10 articles, all on sports nutrition, to include plant-based diets and athletic performance, artificial intelligence and sport nutrition, and other articles like the competitive adolescent athlete and sports nutrition, amongst more, and a great article, a great interview with Roberto Martinez, the current FIFA ranked #1 football team coach in the world. You can access that online as of tomorrow by visiting aspetar.com/journal. Please access it. It's a very contemporary journal. Myself and Marco Cardinali as the guest editors. It's taken some time in the pandemic, and we really appreciate our authors' support and their patience, but we got there and we made it real. So thank you very much. And finally, just looking forward again, if you really want to hear another excellent forum, on the 2nd of June will be the next forum of this series, titled Why Sports and Exercise Medicine is the Speciality of the 21st Century. Moderator being our very own senior sports medicine physician, Dr. Celeste Gertesima, who herself has just actually been seconded to the Supreme Committee for medical support for Qatar 2022 FIFA World Cup. With that, I'd like to bring this session to a close. I'd like to thank again the Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Nibo Popovic. I'd like to thank Aspire Zone Foundation for supporting this initiative, and also the editorial team who this could not have been done without. Thank you very much. Have a good evening from Doha, and I hope you enjoyed our session.